"Margaret, when is the moving truck coming?" Helen called from across the white picket fence with a friendly smile that disappeared the moment she saw my face. I laughed because I thought she had confused me with someone else. "Moving truck?" I asked. Helen walked a few steps closer, holding a small basket of tomatoes she had picked that morning. "Your son told the Johnsons the house was sold last week. I figured you were packing." The smile faded from my face just as quickly as it had faded from hers. "Sold," I repeated. The words sounded strange coming out of my own mouth. I had lived in that house for 38 years. My late husband, Richard, and I bought it when David was 8 years old. We painted every room ourselves. We planted the maple tree in the front yard when he graduated from high school. Every birthday, every Thanksgiving dinner, every Christmas morning after that had happened under that roof. I still owned it. At least I believed I did. Helen looked uncomfortable. "Maybe I misunderstood," she said softly. "I overheard the Johnsons talking at the grocery store. They said David handled everything for you because you wanted a simpler life." I forced a smile that did not feel natural. "There must be some mistake." Helen nodded politely, but I could tell she was no longer convinced. After she walked back to her yard, I stood on my front porch much longer than I intended. The afternoon breeze moved through the maple leaves, and everything looked exactly as it had the day before. My mailbox stood at the end of the driveway. My blue shutters needed another coat of paint. A squirrel ran along the fence. Nothing about my home suggested that it belonged to anyone except me. I told myself people love to gossip. Small towns had always worked that way. One person misunderstood something, another person repeated it, and by the end of the week, everyone believed a completely different story. David worked in residential real estate. Maybe someone had confused one of his listings with my address. That explanation made sense. It had to. I went inside, poured myself a cup of coffee, and decided I would call him after dinner. There was no reason to overreact. David had always been busy. Since becoming a broker, his phone rang almost as often as mine used to when I was teaching. He was organized, confident, and usually one step ahead of everyone else. Sometimes I wished he slowed down long enough to visit more often, but I had never questioned his honesty. Around 6 o'clock, I dialed his number. It went straight to voicemail. I left a cheerful message asking him to call whenever he had a free minute. An hour passed, then another. No call came. I tried again the next morning. Voicemail. By lunchtime, I reminded myself that successful people stayed busy. Mothers should not expect immediate answers from grown sons. That afternoon, I drove to the pharmacy to pick up my prescription. On my way home, I turned onto Maple Street and slowed almost to a stop. A bright red sign stood in the grass at the corner of my property. I had driven past that exact spot hundreds of times. I knew every crack in the sidewalk. I knew every flower bed. I also knew that the sign had never been there before. In bold white letters, it read, "Sold." And beneath it, in much smaller print, was the name of the real estate agency where my son worked. I pulled my car onto the shoulder and stared through the windshield, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me. The sign stood proudly in the grass as if it had every right to be there. The logo belonged to David's agency, but the name of the listing agent was covered by a bright red sticker that simply read, "Under contract." I stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the edge of my yard. My mailbox still displayed my last name. My flower beds had been freshly watered that morning. Nothing else had changed, yet that single sign made the entire property feel unfamiliar. I reached for it, expecting it to be planted loosely in the ground, but it was secured firmly with metal stakes. Someone had taken the time to install it properly. I looked around the neighborhood, half expecting a film crew to appear and tell me it was some elaborate misunderstanding. Instead, I saw Mr. Jenkins across the street raising a hand. "Looks like congratulations are in order," he called with a smile. "I heard your son got a great price for the place." I forced another polite smile, even though my stomach tightened. "I think there has been some confusion," I answered. He looked surprised but quickly nodded and returned to trimming his hedges. I walked back inside the house and locked the front door behind me. The quiet suddenly felt different. I opened the kitchen drawer where I kept my important papers. My property tax receipts were neatly organized. My homeowner insurance policy was current. My original deed rested inside a blue folder exactly where I had left it after Richard passed away. I held the document in my hands for several moments. My name was there. Only my name. No transfer. No joint ownership. No trust. Nothing had changed as far as I knew. I picked up my phone and called David again. Straight to voicemail. This time I did not leave a cheerful message. David, I need you to call me today. There is a real estate sign in my front yard, and people believe my house has been sold. I expect an explanation. I set the phone down and waited. An hour later, it finally rang. Relief washed over me when I saw Lauren's name instead of David's. Margaret, she said warmly. David is tied up with clients all afternoon. He asked me to see what was going on. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. I explained everything, expecting surprise or concern. Instead, she paused for only a second before answering. I'm sure it is just an administrative mistake. You know how these things happen. Something about her response unsettled me. She had not asked which house. She had not asked where the sign was. She had not sounded confused at all. Lauren, I said carefully, have you seen that sign? There was another pause, slightly longer this time. I have not been by today, she replied. Do not worry. David will straighten everything out. We ended the call, but her words echoed in my mind. She had answered too quickly, as though she already knew exactly what I was talking about. That evening, just before sunset, I walked outside to bring in my mail. Mixed between grocery coupons and utility bills was a large white envelope with no return address. Across the front, printed in bold black letters, were 6 words that made my hands begin to shake. Regarding your recent property sale. For nearly a full minute, I simply stared at the envelope resting on my kitchen table. The paper looked ordinary, the kind used by banks and law offices every day, yet those 6 printed words made my home feel unfamiliar. I carefully opened the flap with a letter opener Richard had given me years earlier. Inside was a neatly folded letter and a single business card. The letter began politely enough. Dear property owner, congratulations on the successful closing of your recent real estate transaction. We look forward to assisting you with any future purchases. My heart skipped a beat. I read the first sentence again, hoping I had misunderstood it. Then I looked farther down the page. An address was listed beneath the greeting. It was my address. Every number matched. Every letter matched. I sat down slowly and kept reading. The company thanked me for choosing them to provide title insurance during the transaction. There was even a customer service number if I had questions about my closing documents. Closing documents. I had never attended a closing. I had never agreed to sell my home. I had never even spoken to a title company. I picked up the business card tucked behind the letter. It belonged to a woman named Amanda Pierce, a closing coordinator. I called the number immediately. After a short wait, a pleasant voice answered. Good afternoon. Pierce Title Services. This is Amanda. I introduced myself and explained why I was calling. There was a brief silence on the line before she spoke again, this time much more cautiously. Mrs. Collins, may I place you on a brief hold while I review the file? 2 minutes felt like 20. I listened to soft piano music while my thoughts raced. Finally, Amanda returned. Mrs. Collins, I am sorry, but I am not sure how to respond. According to our records, all required documents were completed several days ago. My grip tightened around the phone. Completed by whom? Another pause followed. I cannot discuss confidential information over the telephone without verifying identity. I am the owner of the property. I replied as calmly as I could. That is exactly why I am calling. Amanda apologized again. If you visit our office with identification, we can review what information we are legally permitted to share. After we ended the call, I realized my hands were trembling. The letter was real. The company was real. Whatever had happened, it existed somewhere beyond neighborhood gossip. I walked upstairs and opened the small fireproof safe in my bedroom closet. Richard always insisted we keep originals of every important document together. My passport, birth certificate, insurance policies, and deed were exactly where I expected them to be. As I closed the safe, something caught my attention. A thin folder that normally sat beneath the deed was missing. At first I convinced myself I had moved it months earlier. Then I remembered exactly what had been inside that folder. It contained copies of my driver's license, my social security card, and several notarized documents I had prepared after Richard passed away. I searched every drawer, every cabinet, every shelf in the bedroom without finding it. I stood in the middle of the room, trying to remember the last person besides me who had been inside this house. The answer came almost immediately. 3 weeks earlier, David and Lauren had insisted on helping me organize old files in preparation for spring cleaning. And for nearly an hour, they had been alone upstairs while I was making lunch downstairs. The next morning, I arrived at Pierce Title Services 15 minutes before the office opened. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that empty space inside my fireproof safe where the folder should have been. The receptionist greeted me with a warm smile and asked me to take a seat while Amanda finished another appointment. The waiting room was quiet except for the soft ticking of a wall clock. Framed photographs of happy families holding house keys decorated every wall. I wondered how many of them had walked out believing every signature in their closing packet had truly belonged to the people listed on the documents. Amanda finally stepped into the lobby and introduced herself. She was professional, polite, and noticeably more serious than she had sounded on the telephone. After checking my driver's license, she led me into a small conference room. "Mrs. Collins," she began carefully, "I have to follow very strict privacy rules, but there are some things I can show you because your name appears in the file." She opened a thick folder and turned several pages toward me. The property address matched mine. The legal description matched my deed exactly. The closing date was 5 days earlier. Then she slid another document across the table. "This is the seller's signature page." I looked down at the name, Margaret Collins. At first glance, it looked remarkably similar to my own handwriting. The shape of the letters was close. The loops were familiar, but it was not mine. I knew every habit of my own signature after signing thousands of report cards, tax returns, and checks during my years as a teacher. Whoever had written this had copied the appearance without understanding the rhythm. The final letter always curved upward when I signed my name. This one stopped abruptly. "I did not sign this," I said quietly. Amanda studied my face for several seconds before speaking again. "I cannot determine whether a signature is authentic, but I can tell you the documents include a notary acknowledgement." She pointed to another page. A notary public had certified that I personally appeared before him to complete the transaction. I stared at the seal. I had never met the man whose name appeared beneath it. Amanda lowered her voice. "Mrs. Collins, if you believe these documents were completed without your knowledge, you should speak with an attorney immediately." I thanked her for her honesty and gathered my papers. As I stood to leave, she hesitated. "There is one more thing. During the closing, another person attended with the seller. I cannot discuss the details, but I can tell you that individual identified himself as a family member." My heartbeat quickened. "Was it my son?" I asked. Amanda looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I am sorry. I cannot answer that question." I left the office carrying more questions than answers. Before driving home, I sat in my car and looked through the copies Amanda had been allowed to provide. One page listed the mailing address where future correspondence regarding the transaction should be sent. It was not my home. It was a post office box less than 10 miles away. Curious, I drove past the small postal center on my way back. As I pulled into the parking lot, I froze. David's SUV was already parked outside, and just as I reached for the door handle, I watched Lauren walk out of the building holding a stack of large envelopes. My first instinct was to step out of the car and demand an explanation. I could already imagine David's surprised expression and Lauren's practiced smile, but something told me to stay where I was. If they truly believed I knew nothing, confronting them now would only warn them that I had started asking questions. So I remained behind the steering wheel with the engine turned off. A few moments later, Lauren walked toward David's SUV carrying 3 large envelopes and a small package. She glanced around the parking lot before handing everything to David through the open passenger window. They spoke for less than a minute. I could not hear a single word, but I noticed something strange. Neither of them looked worried. They looked organized, as though they were simply checking another task off a list they had prepared long ago. David drove away first. Lauren followed in her own car a few seconds later. I waited until both vehicles disappeared before walking inside the postal center. The young clerk behind the counter greeted me with a friendly smile. "How can I help you today?" she asked. I pulled the copy of the closing paperwork from my purse and pointed to the post office box number listed as the mailing address. "I realize you probably cannot tell me who rents this box," I said, "but could you at least confirm whether it is active?" She looked at the paper for only a second before gently shaking her head. "I am sorry, ma'am. Customer information is private." I expected that answer. "I understand," I replied. "Thank you anyway." As I turned to leave, an older employee stocking supplies near the back looked in my direction. He frowned slightly, as though trying to remember where he had seen me before. "Excuse me," he called. "Do you live over on Maple Street?" I nodded. "Yes." He smiled politely. I thought I recognized you. Your son comes in here every few weeks. I forced myself to remain calm. David? Yes, he answered. Nice fellow. Always picking up certified mail. Before I could ask another question, the younger clerk gently interrupted him with a look that reminded him not to discuss customer business. He immediately apologized and returned to his work. Even that brief exchange told me more than I had known an hour earlier. David was familiar with this place. This was not a one-time visit. Whatever connected him to that post office box had been happening for weeks, perhaps longer. I drove home in silence, replaying every conversation I had shared with him over the past several months. I remembered the afternoon he insisted I did not need to worry about sorting my mail because everything important could be handled online now. I remembered Lauren offering to help me organize paperwork upstairs. At the time, both gestures had seemed thoughtful. Now they felt carefully timed. When I pulled into my driveway, Helen was watering flowers near the fence. She waved as usual, but stopped when she saw my expression. Margaret, are you all right? She asked. I hesitated before answering. Can I ask you something? The day you heard people talking about my house, who exactly started that conversation? Helen rested the watering can on the ground and thought for a moment. Actually, now that I remember it, it was not the Johnsons who brought it up first. It was a young couple looking at homes. They said your house had already been shown to them once, but the agent canceled the second appointment because the paperwork had suddenly become complicated. Helen's words stayed with me long after she returned to watering her flowers. The paperwork had suddenly become complicated. That meant someone else besides me had discovered something was wrong before the sale could move forward completely. Whatever had interrupted the transaction might also explain why I was still living in my own home instead of finding strangers on my front porch. I thanked Helen and went inside, closing the front door quietly behind me. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I stopped reacting and started thinking. Richard had always told me that when something did not make sense, I should stop chasing rumors and start following documents. Papers did not gossip. Records did not have emotions. They either matched or they did not. I sat at the dining room table with my blue folder, the copies Amanda had given me, my tax statements, and every property record I could find. I arranged them in chronological order across the table. The dates looked ordinary until I noticed one small detail. About 4 months earlier, my county property tax bill had been mailed almost 2 weeks later than usual. At the time, I assumed it had simply been delayed. Now I wondered whether something had changed long before anyone placed that real estate sign in my yard. I opened my laptop and logged into the county property records website. The ownership information still listed my name, exactly as it always had. That should have comforted me, but it did not. If the official ownership had never changed, then why had a title company processed closing paperwork? Why had prospective buyers toured my property? Why had neighbors congratulated me on selling my own house? None of it fit together. I called the county recorder's office and asked whether any recent documents had been filed against my property. The woman on the telephone was patient and professional. After verifying my address, she paused for a moment. Mrs. Collins, I only see one recently recorded document, she said. It is not a deed. My heart sank. What is it? A limited power of attorney. I felt the room grow very quiet. Who signed it? There was another pause. I cannot discuss the contents over the telephone, but you are welcome to request a certified copy in person. I thanked her and ended the call. A power of attorney. I had never signed one for David or anyone else. Richard and I had discussed the subject years ago and decided we would only consider it if one of us became seriously ill. That day had never come. Before I could gather my keys to drive downtown, my phone buzzed with a text message from David. It was the first direct message he had sent since all of this began. Sorry, I have been busy. Lauren and I are stopping by tonight around 7. We need to talk about the house. I read the message 3 times. Not once did he ask whether he could visit. Not once did he ask how I was doing. He simply announced that they were coming to discuss the house, as though the decision already belonged to them. I looked at the clock. It was only a little after 4 in the afternoon. That gave me nearly 3 hours. As I gathered my purse to leave for the county recorder's office, my eyes landed on the family photograph sitting beside the fireplace. Richard was smiling with one arm around my shoulders and the other resting proudly on 12-year-old David. Behind the frame, partially hidden beneath the wooden backing, was a folded yellow sticky note in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. I had never seen it before. My hands trembled as I slid the faded yellow note from behind the photograph. Richard had always hidden little reminders in unexpected places. Most of them were simple. Grocery lists, anniversary surprises, quotes he wanted me to remember. This one was different. In careful block letters, he had written, "If anyone ever asks you to sign property papers without Michael reading them first, do not do it." I stared at the note for several long seconds. Michael. That could only mean Michael Reed, the attorney who had helped us purchase this house nearly 4 decades earlier. Even after retiring from full-time practice, he still handled a handful of property matters for longtime clients. Richard trusted him completely. I checked the clock again. There was still enough time to visit the county recorder's office before David and Lauren planned to arrive. I placed the note inside my purse beside the copies Amanda had given me and drove downtown. The recorder's office occupied an older brick building that had probably looked exactly the same 20 years earlier. After presenting my identification, I requested a certified copy of the recently recorded power of attorney connected to my property. The clerk disappeared into the back office and returned several minutes later with a sealed packet. "There is a small copying fee," she said. I paid it without hesitation and carried the envelope to a quiet bench outside before opening it. The first page confirmed what I already feared. A limited power of attorney had been recorded 3 months earlier. My name appeared as the person granting authority. David's name appeared as the person receiving it. According to the document, he had been authorized to handle a specific real estate transaction on my behalf. I read every line twice. Then I noticed something that made me stop breathing for a moment. The notarization date was the same afternoon Lauren had insisted on helping me organize paperwork upstairs while David repaired a loose cabinet door in my kitchen. I remembered that day clearly because we had shared sandwiches on the back patio afterward. There had been no attorney, no notary, no legal documents. I turned to the signature page. Once again, someone had copied my handwriting well enough to fool a stranger, but not well enough to fool me. I folded the papers carefully and returned to my car. Instead of driving home immediately, I searched my contacts until I found Michael Reed's number. I expected voicemail because he was semi-retired, but he answered after the second ring. "Margaret? It has been too long," he said warmly. I explained only enough to ask whether he could meet me the following morning. The warmth disappeared from his voice. "Bring every document you have," he said. "And until we speak, do not sign anything. Do not hand over any originals. And do not let anyone pressure you into making quick decisions." I promised that I would not. By the time I reached home, David's SUV was already parked in my driveway. Lauren stood beside the front porch holding a bakery box as though they were stopping by for a pleasant family visit. David greeted me with an easy smile that felt strangely rehearsed. "Mom," he said, "we have been worried about you." I unlocked the front door without answering and invited them inside. Lauren set the box on the kitchen counter while David remained standing. He looked around the room before taking a deep breath. "There is something important we need to discuss," he said. Then he reached into his briefcase and placed a thick stack of papers on my dining room table. The title page read, "Petition for Temporary Financial Conservatorship." For a few seconds, nobody spoke. I looked at the title page lying on my dining room table, then slowly lifted my eyes toward David. He stood with his hands folded in front of him, avoiding direct eye contact. Lauren remained beside the kitchen counter with the same polite smile she always wore at family dinners. It was almost convincing. "What exactly am I looking at?" I asked quietly. David exhaled as though he had rehearsed this conversation many times. "Mom, please do not get upset. We are only trying to protect you." I rested my hand on the papers without opening them. "Protect me from what?" Lauren answered before David could. "From people who might take advantage of you. You have been under a lot of stress lately. The confusion about the house made us realize you might need some help managing complicated financial matters." Her voice was calm and gentle, but every sentence felt carefully constructed. I looked directly at her. The confusion about the house did not begin with me. Neither of them responded. David finally pulled out a chair and sat across from me. "Mom, you have forgotten things recently. You misplaced documents. You have been overwhelmed. A temporary conservatorship would simply allow me to help until everything settles down." I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about what I was hearing. "Interesting," I said. "You seem very confident that I misplaced documents." His expression changed for only a fraction of a second before returning to its practiced calm. Everyone misplaces things sometimes. I reached into my purse and removed the certified copy of the recorded power of attorney. I placed it beside his paperwork without saying a word. David's eyes dropped to the document. Lauren's smile disappeared. Neither of them had expected me to have it. I visited the county recorder's office this afternoon, I said. Would either of you like to explain why a power of attorney bearing my name was recorded 3 months ago? David immediately leaned forward. Mom, that is exactly why we are here. You must be confused about what you signed. I shook my head. No, I remember exactly what I signed that day. Grocery coupons. A birthday card for Sophia. Nothing else. Silence settled over the room. It lasted long enough for the grandfather clock in the hallway to strike the half hour. Lauren finally spoke again, but her confidence had faded. Perhaps the attorney can explain everything. Which attorney? I asked. Neither answered immediately. Instead, David gathered the conservatorship papers into a neat stack as though hoping to redirect the conversation. You should not make decisions tonight, he said. Sleep on it. We can come back tomorrow. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. They had expected me to sign those papers immediately. They had not expected questions. They certainly had not expected documents of my own. I stood and walked to the front door, holding it open. Thank you for stopping by, I said evenly. I already have an appointment tomorrow morning with someone Richard trusted. David looked genuinely surprised. Who? I met his eyes for the first time since they arrived. Michael Reed. The color drained from David's face. Lauren looked at him before she looked back at me. Neither of them said another word. They walked silently to the driveway, climbed into the SUV, and pulled away. I remained on the porch until their taillights disappeared around the corner. Only then did I notice something lying on the dining room floor beneath the chair where David had been sitting. A single sheet had slipped from his briefcase during the conversation. I picked it up, and at the very top of the page, above several typed notes, was a heading that read, Asset Transition Timeline, followed by a checklist of dates that stretched back nearly 6 months. I carried the page to the dining room table and read it twice before I trusted what I was seeing. The heading, Asset Transition Timeline, sounded like something prepared for a business meeting, not a family conversation. Underneath it was a series of dates stretching back nearly 6 months. Every line described a step that had either already happened or was marked as completed. Organize personal records. Update mailing destination. Record limited power of attorney. List property. Secure financial oversight. I felt a chill run through me. These were not random notes. They were a plan. More unsettling was the final section near the bottom of the page. Several items remained unchecked. One line read, Finalize conservatorship. Another said, Complete transfer of remaining assets. Remaining assets. The house had never been the end of the story. It was only the beginning. I carefully slipped the page into a clear plastic folder with the rest of my documents. Richard had always believed that papers told the truth more honestly than people did. That lesson suddenly felt more important than ever. Early the next morning, I drove to Michael Reed's office. Although he had reduced his workload over the years, his office looked exactly as I remembered. Shelves filled with legal books lined the walls, and framed photographs of longtime clients decorated the hallway. When Michael greeted me, his expression changed the moment he saw the stack of folders in my arms. This is more serious than I expected, he said quietly. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing every document in chronological order. He examined the title paperwork, the recorded power of attorney, the forged signature, the conservatorship petition, and finally the timeline sheet David had accidentally left behind. He remained silent for several minutes after reading the last page. Finally, he removed his glasses and looked directly at me. Margaret, I cannot draw legal conclusions until I verify everything independently, but I can tell you this much. None of these documents should be ignored. He pointed to the timeline. This concerns me the most. I asked why. Because it suggests planning rather than confusion. If these notes are authentic, someone anticipated each step long before you became aware of any problem. I nodded slowly. That was exactly what had been haunting me. Michael reached for the telephone and made several brief calls while I waited. He confirmed the recording information with the county office, requested certified copies from the title company, and asked another attorney in his firm to research the notary whose name appeared on the paperwork. When he finished, he turned back toward me. There is something else we should check immediately. He opened an online property database and entered my address. The ownership record still showed my name, exactly as it had the previous day. Then he searched another database containing recent real estate listings. My home appeared almost instantly. Several interior photographs filled the screen. My living room, my kitchen, my bedroom. Every room had been professionally photographed. I stared in disbelief. I never hired a photographer, I whispered. Michael enlarged one of the images. A timestamp appeared in the corner. The photographs had been taken on the exact afternoon David and Lauren came over to help me organize paperwork while I was preparing lunch in the backyard. Michael leaned back in his chair without taking his eyes off the screen. Margaret, he said carefully, whoever arranged these photographs had unrestricted access to your home. Before I could answer, his assistant knocked gently on the office door and stepped inside holding a thin file. The information you requested just came in, she said. Michael opened it immediately. His expression hardened. Then he looked at me and said, "The notary who supposedly witnessed your signature has signed a sworn statement saying he has never met you." For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt something stronger than confusion. I felt certainty. Michael closed the file carefully and folded his hands on the desk. "Margaret, this statement changes everything," he said. "If the notary is telling the truth, then someone used his information without a legitimate signing, or someone falsely represented what occurred. Either way, this deserves immediate attention." I nodded, but my thoughts were already moving somewhere else. "The conservatorship papers," I said. "They wanted me to sign those before I learned any of this." Michael looked directly at me. "Exactly. If you had signed them, you would have voluntarily handed broad financial authority to the very person asking to manage your affairs. That would have complicated everything." The room became very quiet. Richard's handwritten note suddenly made perfect sense. He had never been suspicious by nature, but he believed one simple rule had protected our family for decades. Never sign property documents without independent legal advice. Before I left, Michael prepared several letters requesting that all activity involving my property be temporarily paused while the documentation was reviewed. He also advised me to keep every original record in a secure location and to avoid discussing my next steps with anyone, including family members. "Let them believe you are still trying to understand what happened," he said. "People often reveal more when they think they remain in control." I drove home with the folders resting on the passenger seat beside me. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt unusually calm. Every new document had answered one question while creating another, but together they formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Someone had not acted on impulse. Someone had followed a plan. When I reached my driveway, I immediately noticed that the real estate sign was gone. Only 2 small holes remained in the grass where the metal stakes had stood. I had not removed it. Michael certainly had not. Someone wanted the evidence to disappear. I stepped inside my house and walked slowly through each room. The professional photographs Michael had shown me suddenly changed the way I looked at my own home. I imagined strangers walking through the hallway while I believed nothing unusual was happening. I imagined someone opening closets, measuring rooms, discussing price and timing, all without my knowledge. That evening my telephone rang. The caller identification displayed David's name. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded unusually relaxed. "Mom, I have been thinking about our conversation yesterday. I feel terrible that things became so stressful." I listened without interrupting. "Lauren and I would like to take you to dinner tomorrow night," he continued. "No paperwork, no business, just family." The invitation arrived too suddenly to feel sincere. "That is thoughtful," I replied. "Let me think about it." He sounded relieved. "Of course. Call me whenever you decide." After we ended the call, I stood by the kitchen window watching the evening light fade across the backyard. Something about the invitation bothered me. It was too perfectly timed, arriving only hours after Michael had begun making inquiries. I walked to the mailbox before going to bed, expecting nothing more than advertisements. Instead, I found a large certified envelope addressed to me from the county recorder's office. I carried it inside, opened it carefully, and unfolded the letter. It informed me that a request had been submitted that very afternoon to withdraw the previously recorded limited power of attorney. Attached to the notice was the name of the person who had filed the withdrawal request. It was not David. It was someone I had never heard of before. I read the unfamiliar name 3 times before accepting that I had never heard it before. It was not David. It was not Lauren. It was not Michael. The request to withdraw the limited power of attorney had been submitted by someone named Stephen Harlan. The notice identified him only as the filing representative. Nothing more. I called Michael the next morning before 8 o'clock. He asked me to bring the letter to his office immediately. He studied it for less than a minute before opening his computer. "That is interesting," he said quietly. "Who is he?" I asked. Michael searched several public records and then leaned back in his chair. "He is not connected to your family, but he has filed documents on behalf of a real estate processing company several times over the past few years." I frowned. Why would someone I have never met suddenly withdraw a power of attorney that I never signed? Michael folded the letter and placed it beside the other documents. Because someone realized the document was becoming a liability. Once questions started being asked, keeping it on record became more dangerous than removing it. His explanation fit everything I had seen over the past week. Every time I uncovered another piece of the story, someone quietly tried to erase it. The sign disappeared. The conservatorship meeting suddenly became a friendly dinner invitation. Now the power of attorney was being withdrawn before anyone officially challenged it. "Does removing it erase what happened?" I asked. Michael smiled faintly. "No. Recorded documents leave records. Attempts to undo them also leave records. Sometimes a correction becomes just as important as the original mistake." Before I left, Michael handed me copies of every certified document we had collected. "Keep these somewhere safe," he said. "And there is one more thing. I have contacted the title company and requested a meeting with everyone involved in the transaction. They have agreed." "Including David?" I asked. "Including anyone who participated," he replied. "If they decline, that will also become part of the record." I drove home feeling something I had not felt since Helen first asked me about moving. Confidence. The truth no longer depended only on my memory. It existed in documents, dates, signatures, recordings, and official records. Late that afternoon, my doorbell rang. I expected another surprise from David or Lauren, but when I opened the door, I found Sophia standing on the porch. She looked nervous. "Grandma, can I come in?" she asked. We sat at the kitchen table where she wrapped both hands around a mug of tea before speaking. "Dad does not know I am here," she said. "I found something in his home office last month, but I thought it was just work." She reached into her backpack and removed a small flash drive. "After everything that has happened, I think you should have this." I looked at the tiny device resting in her hand. "What is on it?" Sophia shook her head. "I never opened it. Dad kept it inside a folder labeled Maple Street. My address." Michael had warned me not to examine electronic files alone if they might become evidence. I slipped the flash drive into my purse without plugging it into my computer. Sophia watched me carefully. "You are not going to look?" she asked. "No," I answered. "I am going to let Michael do it the right way." She smiled with visible relief. As she stood to leave, she hesitated at the front door. "Grandma," she said softly, "there is one thing I never told you. About 2 months ago, I overheard Dad telling Lauren that once the house was finished, everything else would fall into place. I thought they were talking about renovations." She looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. "Now I think they were talking about something completely different." The following morning, I met Michael in a secure conference room at his office. His technology specialist connected the small flash drive to a computer that was isolated from the firm's network. "If this contains anything important, we want to preserve it exactly as it is," Michael explained. None of us spoke while the files loaded. There were dozens of folders, but one immediately caught my attention. It was labeled with my home address. Inside were scanned copies of documents I had never seen, photographs of every room in my house, notes about showing schedules, and a spreadsheet listing estimated proceeds from a future sale. Michael continued opening files one by one. Then we found a document that made the entire room fall silent. It was another version of the same asset transition timeline I had discovered beneath David's chair, except this one contained handwritten comments beside each step. Most of the checklist had been completed. The final handwritten note read, "After conservatorship is approved, consolidate remaining accounts and simplify estate administration." Michael leaned back slowly. "This confirms something important," he said. "The objective was never just the house." I nodded. "The house was simply the first asset." He looked at me with quiet sympathy. "That is how it appears. A few hours later, representatives from the title company arrived for the meeting Michael had arranged. Amanda was there, along with the company's compliance manager and outside counsel. They had already reviewed the notary's sworn statement and the inconsistencies in the transaction file. The compliance manager spoke first. "Mrs. Collins, we owe you an apology. Based on the information now available, we have suspended every remaining step connected to this transaction while a full internal review is completed." He slid a written notice across the table confirming that no ownership transfer would move forward until every question had been resolved. Michael then presented the certified records in chronological order. He never raised his voice. He simply placed each document beside the next until the pattern became impossible to ignore. The missing identification records, the recorded power of attorney, the withdrawal request filed after questions began, the staged listing photographs, the timeline, the flash drive. Each piece supported the next. Near the end of the meeting, the compliance manager quietly admitted something that surprised everyone. One prospective buyer contacted us several days ago because they became uncomfortable after hearing conflicting information from neighbors. That inquiry caused us to review the file more closely. I immediately thought of Helen. One honest conversation over a backyard fence had started the chain of events that uncovered everything. As the meeting concluded, Michael gathered the documents and smiled for the first time in days. "Margaret," he said, "today was not about revenge. It was about restoring the truth." Driving home, I realized he was right. I could not undo the disappointment I felt as a mother, but I could protect the life Richard and I had spent decades building. That evening, I sat on my front porch beneath the old maple tree we had planted when David was a teenager. The house looked exactly as it always had. The porch light glowed softly. The neighborhood was peaceful. Helen waved from across the street, and I waved back with a genuine smile. I still believed families could make terrible mistakes, but I also believed trust had to be earned, not assumed. The greatest inheritance Richard left me was never this house. It was the wisdom to pause, ask questions, and protect what mattered before signing away more than property. And because I finally followed that lesson, I was still sitting on my own porch, watching the sun set over the home that had never truly stopped belonging to me.